to our department. Helen comes to us from Colorado College. Well, she's an assistant professor in philosophy. Her work deals mainly in the areas of metaphysics and philosophy of language, and she's really interested in vagueness. And this is exactly the topic she will be talking to us about today, how to reason with vague terms. So please join me in welcoming Helen to the department.
Well, thanks so much for the welcome, and thanks for inviting me. So, great. So I'm talking about vagueness today, and let's see. Got a handout for you. Showing how helpful that'll be. But we'll see. So, vagueness. It's important for ordinary communication. It makes complications for logical reasoning. So that's why it's interesting. But first, let me talk a little about what it is. So I think philosophers usually call the word vague. This is one of the definitions that I think people generally agree on. If it has borderline cases, and what we mean by that is that like a word like, say, bald, applies to some people clearly, it does not apply to other people clearly, right? But then there are people in between where you're like, well, you could call that person bald, you could call them not bald, both would be sort of reasonable. So they're the borderline cases.
I know.
I'm
saying, all the terrible politics.
Just wait, it keeps on going.
Right, there's an infinite example coming up.
Okay, there's not, but next time. Yeah. Just to make it really awkward. Okay. So you could also say vagueness is a matter of degree. Right? A growing teenager eventually goes from being like a short, small child to perhaps a tall adult. And in between, there are going to be some borderline cases. It's a matter of degree. They don't jump suddenly one day from being short to tall, even though if you don't see them for a while, it seems that way. It's not actually how that happens. So intuitively, you might say, vagueness makes some trouble for any simple theory of logic.
We pay our extras now, but that's good. Let's see.
Yeah. Can you send it this way? Yes.
So here's the sort of intuitive trouble vagueness makes for logical reasoning. Suppose I start with the premise like all humans are mortal, right? And I have some knowledge about which creatures are humans. Like, it's pretty straightforward, so I want to know what I can derive from the premises. No problem. I say all humans are mortal. These things are humans, therefore they are immortal. So again, another depressing example. But then suppose we've got some question about what counts as a human. You might say, well, okay, like on the island of Flores, we found these skeletons of Homo floresiensis. That's what we're calling them, but we don't know if they're another species. Some scientists say they're just dwarf humans, right? They're just like modern humans, only smaller. Other scientists say that they really are humans. I can't infer that they're mortal from my premise, right? Because I'm not sure. I'm just not sure what I can infer safely. So it looks like even a really nice, straightforward rule like modus ponens is all messed up as soon as we introduce vague terms. We're not sure what we're doing anymore. We're not sure what we can infer from all humans are mortal and these things might be human, but we're not sure about it. Okay. So that's like the intuitive case. But then sort of the way it's usually kind of driven home is the Sorites paradox. So that's the first thing I put on your handout. This is like an example of the Sorites paradox. I was going to say some other stuff. Let me skip that. So here's the Sorites paradox. I was going to tell you where I'm going with all this. Okay, I can still do that. All right. So, so the reason why I've got the Sorites paradox on here is because philosophers working on vagueness tend to focus exclusively on this paradox. It's like they think this is what characterizes vagueness in some important and deep way. And I think that that's a mistake on page 1. I think it's an interesting paradox, and it's fun for people who like paradoxes. If you're into puzzles, like, it's really cool. But that's not all there is to it. We've got this complex and interesting linguistic phenomenon, and it's more complicated than that. So you can resolve the logical puzzle, but do it in a way that's totally implausible. It gets wrong everything about human reasoning and language use, and I think that tends to happen. Anyway, we'll start with the paradox just because it really highlights the logical problem that vagueness creates. Then, I guess I want to talk about some of the other responses. I'll kind of do a brutal straw man version of other responses to the Sorites paradox than sing the praises of my own theory, right? That's my plan. And then, maybe that's cheating, but that's, no, I'll try to be reasonable about the other views, but I really think they have deep problems. And then finally, I want to do a little bit of applied philosophy of language. Say like, okay, now here's this theory I have of vagueness. What are we going to do with it? Like, what do we do out in the world when dealing with practical problems that have to do with vague terms? So, all right, so that's where I'm headed, the Sorites paradox. This is just an example. This is based on the classic example that we find in ancient Greece, actually. There was a paradox monger at the time of Aristotle. He wasn't interested in, theories of how to live well. He was interested in logical puzzles. And a guy after my own heart came up with this one, and the formalization is mine. But the idea is you start out with like 10,000 grains of sand, and you say, well, that's a heap, no problem. And then you remove 1 grain of sand at a time, and eventually you get 1 grain of sand, it's not a heap anymore. Okay. At what point does it go from being a heap to a non-heap? It's a matter of degree, right? It's like the kid becoming tall overnight. It doesn't work that way. So there's no single grain of sand that you want to say is the last important grain of sand. And once I take that one away, now it's not a heap anymore. So that's what the second premise does. If n grains of sand is a heap, like say 10,000, then n minus 1 grains of sand is a heap for all n such that n is a positive integer. So you can say, well, if it's true of 10,000, then it's true of 999. Wait, 9,999. Right, and so on down the line. Okay? Just, therefore, 1 grain of sand is a heap. Clearly a false conclusion. So there's nothing wrong with the first premise, or if you don't like that one, we could say 100,000 grains of sand. There's nothing wrong with the first premise, so there's got to be a problem with the second, and that's where most people put the blame. Now, I think this is actually an interesting paradox, not because it's kind of a fun logical puzzle, though it is, but because it demonstrates a conflict in how we think about good reasoning. In formal languages, we just avoid vague terms. We can say, I'm working in mathematics. If somebody uses a vague term, I say, 10 points off, you screwed up, your term is vague, define it better. Right? In logic, we can do the same thing. We can, but natural languages are more important for what we do, and we still think we know what good reasoning looks like. So what are the principles? They're not obviously the same ones. Maybe there's some shifting going on. It's hard to say what's going wrong here. There's something wrong with the argument. We know there is good reasoning in natural languages, not just in formal languages. So what do we do? How do we fit this together? And I think the key thing to keep in mind when thinking about the other responses, the straw man responses to the Sorites paradox, they tend to do things like eliminate the vagueness. What they want to do is say, oh, well, we just need to make our terms more precise, and then we can cut off the reasoning in the second premise. We can say, oh, well, there is some grain of sand that makes the difference, because I have defined heap precisely, just like I would in math. It works just fine now, see? But that doesn't work. You can't do that. Because if I say something like, my friend is injured and needs to get to the emergency room, and you say, define friend, we have a problem. It's not working. So ordinary language has to have a better answer than that. We can't just cut the vagueness out. All right, so other solutions. I classified them by the kind of problem they think the Sorites paradox is, the kind of issue they think vagueness is. And there is an easy way of sort of keeping track of these. There's this is sort of weird, but the Sorites paradox, we don't know how to approach vagueness. There's no consensus about whether it's a philosophy of language issue or metaphysics or epistemology. People really just genuinely disagree. So that's kind of fun. I think it's natural to think that it's an issue in philosophy of language because vagueness seems to me like a matter of representation. Like, what's going on when our word doesn't seem to map onto the world quite right is that the world has all of this complexity that our language doesn't quite capture. So we've got a word like tall, and it sort of picks out a class of people, but not really. It's fuzzy at the edges. We don't know what exactly we mean. the world isn't like that. People are a determinate height, right? And so the word doesn't quite get the world entirely precisely right. It's not inaccurate, it's just imprecise. So it looks like an issue of representation. Like a blurry photograph doesn't capture all the detail of the scene. Similarly, our words, you might think, don't really capture all the detail of what reality is like. So that's a sort of why I think, on the face of it, it looks like it's a problem in language. But here's a sort of, metaphysical solutions are kind of cool. It's kind of wild. They think that the world is itself vague. So objects are not sharply bounded. And that's sort of cool, right? So here's one way you might think of it. Say there are like, I'm not trying to criticize the table. Suppose there are like 300 motes of dust on the table here. And they might be considered part of the table or they might not. It depends on like, you know, how much the dust has worked its way into the grain. You know, maybe it's part of the table. So 300 motes of dust, plus or minus. What a metaphysical theory of vagueness would want to do in order to solve the Sorites paradox is to say, my word, or my term, I guess, it's two words, this table picks out the object, the hunk of wood, maybe the piece of glass on top, and the 300 motes of dust, plus or minus. And it's equally vague. It picks out the plus or minus, like it gets that whole complexity. And so my word maps onto the world perfectly. And I can say exactly what is part of the table and what's not. When I say this table, I mean exactly what it is, this vague object. And so my vague term picks out a vague object exactly. And we can say, well, what about one more mote of dust? What about the 300 first? And I say, nope, 300. That's exactly, because that's what the table is, my word maps onto the world, and that's how it works. Okay, a couple big problems. Why would you think that there's a sharp line between those 300 motes of dust and the 300 first? Also, we use our words differently on different occasions. I might, on one occasion, mean to include the glass top, and on another occasion I don't. On one occasion, maybe after the table has just been very thoroughly cleaned, I might like say, you know, the motes of dust are no longer part of it. You know, we're just not that careful. So our words are changing a little bit all the time. We use them a little differently all the time. They don't map onto the vagueness of the world if there's a precise vagueness of the world, exactly. I also kind of think that metaphysical vagueness is a little incoherent. To say that the world is vague is just kind of strange. As a representational thing, it makes sense. Right? A word or an image or something doesn't pick out all the detail in the world. But to say that an object itself is vague, well, relative to what? Seems like an obvious question. Like, do you have a form in mind and it's vague relative to the form or something? I mean, yeah, and metaphysical vagueness isn't a very well developed area yet, so I'm not sure where people would want to actually go. Right, next, epistemological solutions. There's one big one, epistemicism, and the people who invented it actually don't think it's plausible, but true anyway. They think, well, it's not plausible, but it's the best we've got. Right? And that's not a ringing endorsement, but I have heard actually some people who think it is plausible. I was at a conference where somebody just like stood up and sort of came out of the closet as an epistemicist, and everybody else was aghast, you know. And I was like, well, okay, all right, you know, let's be accepting and welcoming here. This is okay. But so the kind of answer is that the inventors were Tim Williamson and Roy Sorensen. They're the big champions of it. And both of them are really smart people. They just think all the other answers are less good. So here's what we're stuck with. It's that our words have secret, hidden meanings that we can't know. Okay? So the world is perfectly precise, and our words are perfectly precise. But we don't know where those precise boundaries are. So when I say tall, there are definite boundaries to what can count as tall, and I just don't know what they are. And then when you try to fill it out a little, like, well, what could create these hidden secret meanings that we don't know about? There are a few different answers you could give. One of the more plausible ones, I think, is that something like facts about language use. You could do like a statistical analysis of a population of competent English speakers or something and figure out where they would tend to draw the cutoff for tall or something. Use that as your deciding line for the sharp boundary. I don't like secret hidden meanings, and I think most people don't. I think it's implausible to say there really is a single grain of sand that makes the difference. Like, that's just how the world is, you know, there just are, you know, if heaps are real objects, then they have sharp boundaries, and that's how it is. And our word heap picks out exactly those objects. It's a hard line. Right? That's the view. So, yeah, all right, and then we've got philosophy of language. And I wanted to mention two different theories in the philosophy of language before I get to mine. They're both semantic theories. So that is, they take the issue with vagueness to be grounded in the meanings of words. So if you want to explain how vagueness works, you're looking at the meanings of words and maybe shifting the meanings and something like that. I think it's pragmatic instead. I think it's with the use of the words. I think that's the key move. But supervaluationism, to begin with, is it's been around for a little while. I think Kit Fine came up with it in 1975 or something like that, and it's still pretty popular. It's a cool idea, and I think a lot of people like it because it's sort of technical and mathy, and so you sort of get the feeling that something slick is happening there. And I was really attracted to it for a long time, but let me see. How does this work? So, right, so the reason for the name supervaluationism is because they reject our ordinary truth values, true and false, as being not good enough. They're inadequate. And they're inadequate because of vagueness. So what we want are super truth and super falsity. That's what we care about when we're judging arguments. So if you're trying to find validity, truth and falsity aren't really what's at issue. It's super truth and super falsity that you should care about. So what is super truth? A statement is super true if on any reading of it, it still comes out true. So say you've got something like the Empire State Building is tall. Alright, if we're talking about tall buildings, yeah, it comes out as tall. Maybe if you change the comparison class around though, it might not. There are a lot of taller buildings now than when it was built. So maybe it's a borderline case. If it's a borderline case, it's not super true. If there's any reading of that statement, the Empire State Building is tall, that makes it come out possibly false, then no good, not super true. And so the only arguments that come out as valid for a supervaluationist are the ones that don't have any borderline cases involved. They're basically eliminating vagueness. And the way that, I was going to start drawing on the board. I should try to restrain myself. Otherwise I'll be covered in chalk. I won't actually get anywhere. You like drawing? Feel free to learn.
I like pictures.
I like pictures too. Well, they kind of got this idea. It's like, here's a way of thinking about it. It's like you start out with this, you start out with tall, and it's really open what it might mean, but you can kind of divide up the cases. You can say, okay, anybody over this height, these people are definitely clearly tall. And anybody over here, these people are definitely not tall. And these are the people in between. They're the borderline cases. All right, so super truth. If we want to say that a sentence is super true and it has the word tall in it, it better be describing somebody in that area. That's how it works. And then it gets more complicated. I don't really know if I need to go into much more than that. That's the idea. And so they reject the second premise of our Surrey's paradoxical argument here because they say, well, it's not going to turn out true. I mean, it may be that we're not sure exactly where this line is, but we know absolutely that there is a grain of sand that could make a difference. Because we know when you go from the cases that are super true over here to the cases that are not, the borderline cases, what you've done is you've moved from n grain of sands to n grains of sand to n minus 1. Or you've moved from like 6 feet tall to 5'11", and you just crossed the line. So there's going to be a line that you cross. That's how they resolve the problem. Right, I think that sort of like with epistemicism and metaphysical vagueness, what we're doing is just ignoring how vagueness actually works. I mean, this doesn't address the borderline cases. It says you just can't create a valid argument that has anything to do with borderline cases. The minute you do, you've stepped outside of reasoning that we can work with. So they're sort of avoiding the vagueness. They're either eliminating it, saying, you know, it's no good, we have to get rid of it. Either our words really are already precise, or the world and the word connect up precisely, so there's no vagueness there, or we can't deal with the vagueness, so just don't. Right? They're not addressing how it works, and I think it does work. I think vagueness is an essential part of language, and how it works is interesting. It shouldn't just be something that we push off and say, that's no good. So, right, so contextualism. Just move on. The next kind of response, that's all I want to say about superevaluation. Contextualism is pretty awesome. It's a sort of loosely related group of theories of vagueness. And I'm not totally up on all of them yet, because they're very different from one another, but they're united by the idea that the context of discourse it partly determines the meanings of our vague terms, right? So, when you use the word tall, you use it in a context. You're talking about tall buildings, say. And that's going to determine partly what you mean. And in some conversations, the context will be very narrow. You're not just talking about tall buildings, you're talking about the Empire State Building and buildings taller than it, or something like that. So, the context partly determines the meanings of our vague terms. So what they think is going on. Let me give you one technical term here. They have this idea that I think is dead right. They say that vague words have open texture. And what they mean by that is that the meanings, I should have put this on the handout. I didn't. I think I mentioned it. Yeah, it's like point 1 under my own theory, because I'm keeping this part. Right? All I say is that I'm keeping it, though. Meanings of vague terms don't fully determine their extensions. I'm not going to accept it quite in this form, but I think the basic idea is right, that a lot of our language is like this. The word you're using doesn't fully pick out a determinate class of objects or a determinate class of things that have a property or something. What you've got is it's open at the edges. The texture of it isn't like sharply divided. Instead, it's open. So contextualists think that the context in which a vague word occurs, like tall, when it occurs in the context of talking about buildings, then the open texture is narrowed a bit. The meaning of the vague term changes so that the extension is a little more determinate. And they can use it to resolve the Sorites paradox by saying, look, we just need to, how does that work? They use the context to determine where you can draw the line between heaps and non-heaps. And so they allow the possibility of drawing a line somewhere between some n grains of sand and some n-1 grains of sand. Yeah, there may be some, it's not meant to eliminate vagueness. The idea is that you start out with these vague meanings, and then you shift to more precise ones in different contexts.
Can I ask a quick question
Please
about
do.
just what they're up to there? Because when you add the word buildings to the word tall, you now have another word that you have to define. So you have what is tall,
Mm-hmm.
what is a building. So why doesn't that compound the problem rather than help narrow down tall? Because you're just trying to define tall. You know, to be limited by this other word, which has a big problem.
I think
I'm wondering what they think is, why they think this is an advance over the imposition of tall.
You might think, this is probably, you probably need a more specific context.
Just a different example.
Well, I think we could make it seem more plausible if you were considering an actual conversational context. This is always meant to be like, you know, not just this case, but this is taking place within like genuine discourse. And so the context of the conversation will help us to know what the person we're talking to means by the word. And so if you just say, yeah, I'm tacking on buildings here, and that helps me to delimit the meaning of tall, kinda, like,
You're
I
still
know
in
you
an
don't mean
abstract
6
space of the
feet.
theoretical example, so it's not really.
Right. It's meant to be, like, Stuart Shapiro actually talks about David Lewis's scorekeeping in a language game. Like, we're moving along through this language game, and I'm keeping score, I'm keeping track of what you've said so far, and what kind of moves are permissible as a result, and what interpretations of what you're saying are permissible as a result. So,
Gotcha.
yeah,
Okay.
that's the idea. Thanks. Okay, so one of the biggest objections to contextualism is that when you change the meaning of the word, you're really just talking about something different. So you start off talking about a nice run-of-the-mill, like, vague word. You've got tall, and that's great, and we know that it's got this open texture. And now you want to like move over here and start talking about, where is that? About like tall relative to, I'm gonna make it much more specific this time to see if maybe that helps. Relative to the other people. And so what you might mean by tall is definitely narrowed there, but when they shift meaning from this nice open meaning to this more specific meaning, are they still talking about the same word? Or they just changed the subject? Really, you're not telling me how the vague word works, you're telling me how to move, again, from a vague word to a non-vague word, or a less vague word. You're eliminating the vagueness again. You're not telling me how vagueness works. And that's, I think it's a serious objection. So I'm trying to run something that's kind of like a contextualist line, my view. It's kind of like that, but I go pragmatic instead of semantic. So I'm not changing meanings. I'm talking about this very word being used differently in different contexts. So that's where my view enters in. So, so I've got to put all the bad responses. Now here's the right one.
Super right?
Okay. Right, super right. It's so here's. Yeah, I can redo that to say this way. So according to my theory, which I call vagueness as permission, a use of a term is vague. I'm talking uses, not terms, but a use. If and only if it has what I call lax, unsharp borderline cases. That's just a way of defining borderline cases. I'll get into it in a minute. In a salient context. So we've got tall is not a vague word. Tall is often used vaguely. And so we think of it as paradigmatically vague because it's so often used vaguely. But almost all the words we use in a certain context could be vague. Right? I already described like the table, perhaps like this table. I think in the right context, when I up the ante and say, well, are we really counting those 300 motes of dust? Right? Now I've changed the context so that I'm using this expression vaguely. Now it would be hard for you to say exactly what you mean by this table. But if we were just talking about the furniture in the room, and I said, hey, could you help me move this table a couple inches over? It's kind of in the way. Like, you'd know exactly what I meant. Exactly, close enough for the purposes, right? So I think it's a pragmatic issue. It's vague in some contexts because it's used vaguely. It's not vague in others because it's not used vaguely in this context. So let me talk about these borderline cases. Borderline case is, it's like kind of how people define vagueness, but it's sort of hard to know what anybody means. So here's what I mean by it. A use of a term, in order for it to be vague, it can't just have like something in the middle here. This has to be vague too. So that's basically it. So when I said lax borderline cases, I mean there are things in the middle here that you could reasonably call tall, not tall, or borderline, as you wish. And when I say unsharp, I mean this line isn't a sharp line. I mean, it's fuzzy all the way down. Alright, and then let me talk about why I want to call this vagueness as permission. So, I think these borderline cases are characterized by a kind of permission. I think it's permissible for us to call these tall, not tall, or borderline. It's permissible for us to call anything in this general area borderline or tall, right? And if you don't like this, if you think it needs to be narrower, we can make it narrower. We can say, well, all right, maybe those borderline cases, maybe that takes in too much. Like if we're talking about tall people or something, like you don't just go from like, the same person can't be called short and tall, right? It's good, you know, maybe it needs to be more precise. Maybe we've got more borderline cases than that. Well, then you build in some more. You say, like, oh, like maybe I've got short and then medium and then tall, and I've got borderline cases in between both. And then I've got my, like, sort of unsharpness in between both. Okay. We want it to be fuzzy all the way down. And all of this is that it's permissible for us to say certain kinds of things. So it's all about what you can get away with in a conversation. And so this notion of permissibility, it really does owe a lot to open texture, but I don't think I can call it open texture because this has to do with a certain particular class of terms, the vague terms, and what's wrong with them. Their meanings are screwed up in this way. And I don't think that's what's going on. I think what we've got is ubiquitous vagueness. I think almost any term can be vague. It's not a particular class. It's not like we're just picking out bald and tall and putting the vague words together and saying what's wrong with them. It's that almost any term can be used vaguely. And what's going on there is that its meaning does have some openness to it. It does have something like open texture. The meaning isn't fully determinate. But what we want to do is not restrict the meaning further. We don't want to say, oh, and so what I need to do is fix the meaning. No, it's fine for it to have that. We just typically want to use those words carefully. All right, yeah, so I think, well, have I talked about all the things, like key features here? I still agree with the contextualists about open texture, kind of, except I think the meanings don't change. So yeah, let's talk about this flow chart. So here's another big difference between going pragmatic as opposed to going semantic. I think that what we want is not a semantic theory that will tell us once and for all what's happening when the meanings, what's happening when a meaning changes from a vague meaning to a more precise meaning, because I don't think that's what's going on at all. And instead, I think there's this process that happens in conversation that is a matter of settling vagueness for the present purpose. So we start off talking to each other, right? And you might think, is this communication being impeded by salient borderline cases of a vaguely used term? Which I'm sure you think to yourself all day. But what I mean, okay, here we are. We're talking about, say, like, I have conversations with my husband about the laundry a lot. Say we're talking about the laundry. He's done something stupid again. Like, he threw a black t-shirt in with the whites, and I don't know why. And I'm like, look, why are you doing this? No, it's very sweet that he does the laundry now, but he's still learning how. I did the laundry all through grad school. It's his turn, right? All right, so you might think, he thought the t-shirt was close enough to white. He thought it was kind of gray. I think it's clearly too dark to go in with the whites. And so, so we disagree. He thinks it's a borderline case. And in the context, maybe I need to be more precise. Maybe I need to say, okay, look, I understand it's reasonable to call that gray, but for the purposes of doing laundry, that's a black t-shirt, and don't put it in with the whites, because look at like what the whites look like now. If communication is being impeded by the gray t-shirt, right, there is this borderline case, and we haven't established how to count it yet, then we need to work something out. Most of the time, I think, there's no problem. So that's why I put no in the normal case over on the left. Most of the time, I think borderline cases just don't come up much. Like, he can handle the laundry, I don't know, at least half the time, right? Most of the time when we're talking, we don't have these problems. Maybe in philosophy, it's more common to not understand each other, but if you just ask, like, is there a place where I can get a beer around here? Like, the vagueness isn't relevant. I'm kind of using the words vaguely, but it's no problem. Because communication isn't impeded. And so, the way I think this works, like, here's how I think it works for the Sorites paradox. I'm challenging the second premise, but what I'm saying is, in the normal case, it doesn't arise. It's like saying, oh, replace n minus 1 in this second premise of the Sorites argument with n minus 10,000, right? That's what the normal case is like. I've got this heap over here, and I've got 1 grain of sand over there, and I ask you, you know, so 10,000 grains of sand, that's a heap. Take away 10,000 or 9,999 grains of sand, is it still a heap? He's like, no. It's like, drawing a line is easy. So when we make this change, drawing a line just happens. It's like, it's perfectly natural. There's no relevant vagueness here because we're not using the word vaguely. All the cases are clear. And I think that's how language works most of the time. If it were true that these vague terms were causing problems, we wouldn't have that kind of ease of communication most of the time. What's happening is they're not vague terms. They're just words, and most of them happen to be vague in some contexts. Most of them have this kind of openness. But in the particular context I'm talking about, where we're going from 10,000 to 1, there's no vague usage there. I know which ones are heaps and which ones aren't. And I think that's the way it works most of the time. Right, so the second premise of the Sorites paradox, as it's written here, it doesn't come up in the normal case. And that's why I think we get around just fine with our vague, put it that way, with our open words, with our words that are potentially vague. Is that? All right, the tougher case. So communication is impeded, the gray t-shirt made it into Dwight's. We've got a problem. So, all right, now we need to further specify the vaguely used term. And to say, okay, I understand that's gray. Maybe it looks closer to white than to black for you, but for present purposes, let's count that one as black. Just put it in with the darks, it's better that way. Okay? So we've got this practical consideration that leads us to make a certain kind of determination about the borderline cases. I think that's how they get resolved most of the time. We say, okay, we need to further specify how we're going to use the term in this practical context, in this practical situation. Does that sort all of the relevant borderline cases into categories? If we've got them all the relevant ones, all the ones that are at issue right now, if we've got them sorted into categories, then the Sorites paradox did arise for us. There was some borderline case. Things changed by degrees from like white and gray to black, and it was fuzzy in between. We weren't sure how to categorize these things. There were borderline cases. And then we decided we should draw the line here. So there's some practical consideration that allowed us to resolve how we're going to use the terms to describe the things that are relevant in our situation. So we've got this practical solution. The Sorites paradox is resolved relative to the things that are at issue. If not, then we need to go back and draw another line. So if I draw the line here and then it turns out there's some like grayish white stuff kind of in between, we need to make a decision about where those go. Right? So we're gonna have to draw a new line. But I can do that all day. Sometimes there'll be arbitrary decisions, sometimes there will be serious considerations that go into making the choice. But the choice is up to us. We have the permission to do this. Our language is open and flexible in this way. So, yeah, I'm gonna skip the next example because it's that. But okay, so I think we can think of the tougher cases, how we handle these, as kind of in 2 steps. First, you determine roughly which of the items are borderline cases, which ones are causing us problems. So where can I draw a line? And then you come up with the second step, you come up with where you think the line would best be drawn. And once the boundary's been drawn, all the problematic vagueness is eliminated, problematic vagueness, for the purposes of the conversation. The word is still vague. I mean, words aren't vague, but the word still has the open texture. It still has the ability to be interpreted differently and used differently in different contexts. We haven't gotten rid of that. Everything that's useful about ordinary language as opposed to formal languages is still there. We've just decided how we're going to use it in a particular context. So, yeah, there was an objection that I wanted to mention. I think this one stands out as being, well, I think it stands out for a lot of people who work on vagueness. They say, okay, you've solved the Sorites paradox for like 5 objects. What about infinitely many, right? What are you gonna do about that one? Like, you're just gonna keep drawing lines all day? What's the answer? And, you know, that's not really a solution to the paradox. It's a solution to like an individual example of the paradox that might come up in daily life. Here's what you do. Here's how you handle it when it comes up. But you don't solve the paradox. And I think, well, I think that's right. I mean, it's an objection if you really want like a solution to the logical puzzle, like to the logical puzzle. What I've given you is a way of handling it when it comes up. But I haven't said like, and that's it. And if there are, you know, infinitely many borderline cases, how are you gonna solve this problem for all the possible Sorites paradoxical arguments that could arise? I don't think you want that though. I don't think we actually need a solution to all the ones that don't exist. Like, what we want is a method for handling the problem when it arises. And that's what we've got. So it's a way of handling it when it comes up. But if you say, okay, now we've got infinitely many things to deal with, and you've only told me about like these 4, whatever. I'm gonna say, all right, well, your infinitely many things, that's a new context. You're using it in a new way, and I'm gonna have to have a new answer, and that's fine, right? So for this context of like, you know, 4 or 5 objects, I've got my answer. For the infinitely many, there's my line, right? Like, I can draw a line in any number of things. I know how to do it now. So give me the conversational context, give me the things that I need to categorize, and I can come up with a way to do it because I've got the method. But this doesn't create a one-size-fits-all, like, and now there is no more vagueness kind of solution. I think that's a virtue, though, a feature, not a bug, right? So there's room for further stipulation. Okay, and now here's the cool part that I really haven't thought about a whole lot, but I think this is the part I care more about than the rest. So I want to extend this. I want to say, and this matters. It's not just a method for solving this paradox. What I care about is vagueness, right, and how it works in language and how we get around in the world. So, okay, let me start with a philosophical problem. I have to preface this a little. Okay, metaphysicians all think that other metaphysicians are working on stupid, bogus, verbal only, like merely verbal disagreements. It's just a thing about metaphysicians. They're all like, well, causation is a big deal, but time, that's nonsense, you know? Or the reverse. It's like, we just sit back and make fun of each other's research programs. So, but we don't agree about which ones are merely verbal disputes and which ones aren't. I think that's just, I don't know, snarky metaphysicians or something, but here's a debate that I think is actually really important and really interesting, though it is, in a sense, merely verbal, right? I think it's about a vague term, and so I think we have permission to draw lines where we want to, and that metaphysics maybe can't answer the question. So here's the problem. What is a person? Right, defining person. Here's some context where it comes up. When does a new or proto-human gain personhood? Is a human organism the same person over the span of its whole life? You know, all these, right? What if it loses its memories? Right? Are non-human great apes persons? Could an android be a person? What about humans in permanent vegetative states? Are they persons, right? Okay. And there aren't straight answers. You don't say, okay, well, obviously the term person, we've got, I'm just gonna erase tall and make it person. We've got, you know, the non-person and person and borderline cases, and you draw this line like once and for all. Like an epistemicist would have to say, and there really is a fact of the matter, and these things fall on this side, these things fall on that side. That's how it is. That's how the world is. That's how our language is, and we just don't know where the line is. That's it. Okay. I think that's a mistake, because I think there are a lot of considerations that need to go into figuring out where we want to draw the line. And in each of those cases, it may be a little different. Person, the vague term, the term person is used vaguely in lots of different contexts, right? And in each context, there might be a slightly different answer. We want them to cohere with one another. So if you say, in this case, what I care about is intelligence. I think you've got to be at least so capable of agency in order to be a person. So I'm going to count androids and great apes. But I also want to count people in vegetative states, because otherwise, like, you know. So then you might think, oh, but I'm not being consistent. Consider though, you've got different contexts. You might be able to swing this. You could say, look, the considerations that are relevant here are something like agency, and here it's something like whether the person is a moral patient, not a moral agent. And so, you know, what I'm interested in changes with the context. And it's actually very complicated. That's what I think. It's very complicated. And so, so we're not looking for like a straight answer. We're not saying, you know, okay, metaphysicians, tell me where the line goes. Instead, what we want to say is something like, person is used vaguely in these contexts, and it's going to be hard to say what the right answer is. And so all of these considerations really are relevant. It's permissible for you to draw the line in any number of different places, but you should have good reasons for why you make the choice that you do. So that's a nice philosophical case. I suspect there are lots of places in philosophy where we've got something like a vague term causing trouble. And then in practical issues. So, I don't know if this made it onto a little poster or not. I mentioned something about defining marriage. I just wanted to make the talk seem more exciting than it really is. Mostly I wanted to talk about my theory of vagueness, but in the last like 2 seconds. Suppose you've got an argument against gay marriage, and it depends upon the definition of marriage. Right? Okay, all right. Marriage is used in lots of different ways. It's obviously kind of open. It's got this sort of open texture to it. And so if you want to say something about, I don't even know if borderline case is the right way to put it, but there are cases that we're not quite sure about because they haven't come up before, like androids, right? I mean, until you start thinking about it, you don't have an answer. You have to start thinking about, oh yeah, what do I mean by person? Yeah, what do I mean by marriage? Saying, well, marriage is defined this way is not an answer. That's like stating, I've drawn the line here, therefore, you know, nothing follows from that. Giving reasons for where you're going to draw the line is where all the work happens. So I think this is a way to respond to people who want to make the debate overly simple. We need to say, look, I understand marriage is used differently in different contexts. You advocate a particular use of the word. I think it's a poor choice because, and then you give your reasons. And you say, you know, I'm going to draw the line somewhere else. And I have good reasons for where I'm drawing the line than yours. Okay? The debate has to move back to the reasons and not just stop at the line drawing. And I think that's a way of making our political dialogue a little more sophisticated. Not that any of you guys are into unsophisticated political dialogue. This is the wrong crowd, right? But if you were, though, I would say it's a bad idea. You know, we've got these vague words. They cause all kinds of trouble. You need to have reasons for where you're going to draw them. Sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes it's like, oh, does that count as, does the Kindle count as a book or not? Most of the time, who cares? Like, you can call it your book if you want to. That's fine. Go ahead. Right? In some contexts, it might matter. If you say, like, oh, I dropped a book in the toilet. Everybody laughs, and then you say, no, it was my Kindle. Like, oh, it's a much bigger deal. Right? Yeah, so, you know, sometimes where you draw the line might be kind of arbitrary. Other times, I think it is not at all arbitrary. You need good reasons for the choice of where you put it. So, okay, so here's just another quick slam at the other theories, and we'll stop. If we're dealing with metaphysically vague objects, it would be a mistake to draw new lines. You couldn't say, and here's where I put the line between persons and non-persons in this context, because the objects just are vague. Persons are vague. The word person maps perfectly onto the vagueness of the world. You don't get to make any decisions there. So I think it's wrong for that reason. If epistemicism were true, there would already be a correct place to draw the line. We just don't know what it is. So all of your moral considerations or practical considerations, irrelevant, right? The epistemologist can tell you what person or marriage means. That's no good. If supervaluationism were true, we just couldn't talk about borderline cases in valid arguments. That doesn't help us with our reasoning about tricky cases, right? Because the valid argument has to preserve super truth. You don't get super truth when you're talking about the borderline cases. And then if contextualism were true, the meanings of our words would change every time you made a decision about borderline cases. I think vagueness as permission, my theory, is the better explanation both of how to solve the Sorites paradox and, more importantly, the better explanation of how vagueness works in ordinary reasoning. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions. Sorry.
Well, I just want to make sure I got the parts and pieces. What makes your thought distinctive from, say, the contextualist? And the thought is that the term, or our terms in language, are not themselves vague. So their meanings are not vague. This is the part I get confused on. But the use is vague, or can be vague, in particular contexts. And what makes it vague is not some independent fact that there's certain kinds of uses that are just open text, vague. I'm using that word too much. But rather, there are particular, it becomes the case that a use is vague when there are certain conversational or inferential problems generated. So I'm not sure how to proceed. So vagueness is a consequence of some other kind of inferential problem.
Right.
Because I'm trying to think of just not as conversation, but as just trying to reason through a problem on my own. And I realize I'm not sure what to do with the t-shirt.
Right. I'm running up against a borderline case.
Yes. Now, and it's borderline only because it's causing a problem with a set of inferences that I want to do anyways, or a set of projects that I have.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. So the thought is then it's not, and I'm not sure how to keep all these things apart. The terms are not themselves vague. Their meaning, whatever that is, because it seems like at times you're using meaning as extension.
Yeah.
But the extension isn't vague. Is that, are we still fair?
Yeah, you know what, this is where I'm not sure how to use the terms in a way that would be unproblematic, right? Because people use vague in different ways.
Well, and
So-
meaning is no help either, right?
Yeah,
There's
meaning
plenty
is-
of meanings of meaning. Yeah, it's a superstar of vagueness.
It sure is,
yeah.
yeah. But yeah, there is this sort of openness to our terms, right? So I don't want to say that they're vague, because I want to say it's the usage that's vague. But nevertheless, I think that our terms have this possibility of vagueness built into them.
Sure.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I don't think it's a feature of any particular set of terms.
Right.
It's almost every word we use.
Yeah, and this is one of the things I was thinking is, so in one way your response to these kind of, look, when these practical issues take place, there isn't, I guess this would be against the meaning business, it isn't that there's an independent fact sitting out there in language that we would appeal to. Instead, we get to be in charge of our own terms. And so we're going to appeal to some set of practical considerations to let our projects go through. And we see that, for example, in the ordinary course of scientific reasoning all the time. Like your business about personhood is very easy to replicate for species,
Yeah.
right? At some point you clearly got non-humans, then you've got humans, and then you know, there are these people in between that are kind of human-y and they're not that human-y, and which one's the first human? And the correct answer for the biologist is shut up. If you want to know where the first human is or which one's the first human, the correct answer is be quiet. And you go, but which one is it? The answer is, I don't care. Because it fundamentally doesn't make a difference to my doing of a project, so it's not really a borderline case. It's a logician's borderline case, but it's not a borderline case for the theoretician. Or at least because it's not impeding theoretical progress, right? I don't have to make a decision about where to put certain folk.
I could imagine biological contexts where it would matter, like where
Well,
they would have to make a decision about it.
There are going to be, right? But then,
But-
then that's when your thing kicks in, right? Is
Yeah.
that if it is the case that somehow it's getting in the way of my doing some biological project, then I have to look into consideration. So the cases would be things like reproduction. It seems really easy when you think about mammal critters, right? Boys, girls, they get together and then they produce things that look like themselves. But then there are all those other damn organisms on the planet that do things that might be growth. Is it reproduction? I don't know. Yet when I'm doing botany, these things all of a sudden become important. I need to be able to figure out how to count individuals if I'm going to do evolutionary stuff. Yeah, so I have to figure out, is the little spider plantling hanging off, is it that merely growth or is it an individual? Because if it's an
Nice.
individual, I can run evolutionary theory on it, right? Because I can have reproduction. But if it's growth, evolutionary theory is irrelevant.
Nice, yeah, that's a really cool example.
Yeah, no, I take it this is the idea. It's just once we run into a problem that's impeding a project, we appeal to practical considerations, and not to think that there's some independent set of facts out there that makes something more or less vague.
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
Oh, I thought there would be like a devastating objection at the end of that.
No.
It really was like.
No, because
yes.
from doing the Phil Bio, from the science side,
Yeah.
this is how we proceed all the time, and nobody really worries about solving personhood questions. And
Right, right.
it's once there's a problem, we figure out a way to solve it that allows us to continue on our project and move on. So that sounds
Yeah,
like
yeah.
the story.
Uh-huh.
But
Yeah,
the-
actually, the other example I was gonna give that I skipped because I thought, like, I mean, I think it's a cool example, but it's just, I hate talking about it. It's, the CDC has defined what it is to be overweight, right? For the purpose of research mostly. You need to be able to set aside, like, this factor when you're doing research on all kinds of things. You need to be able to say, well, is that, does smoking actually increase the incidence of heart disease independent of other factors, like being overweight? Because maybe smoking goes along with poverty, which goes along with being overweight, right? I don't know if that's true, but suppose, so you need to be able to set it aside. So they've come up with a metric. It's really simple and obviously false, right? Because it draws a sharp line between people who are healthy and people who are overweight, right? There's no sharp line. It's not like that. We don't work like that. But you draw the line because you need it for research. You've got a practical goal, and this would help you in your practical goal. Fine,
Well,
that's fine. But you don't change the meaning of the term. I mean, maybe in time it works its way into the culture, meanings shift, but, I mean, I think, I don't know, it's a use. It's a
Yeah, I
use
think
of-
the concentration on use is stronger because the meaning business gets sufficiently complicated that I'm not sure precisely what you mean by you haven't changed the meaning of the term. If
Yeah.
I decide that, hey, reproduction involves two genders and I'm not counting in crazy plant people, it seems like we've made a decision about the meaning of the term, right? We've changed the meaning, or it's contextually changed. So I'm not sure what the problem is with the context, guys. But I'll get out of the way.
So,
I'm sorry,
kinda-
Chad.
Yeah, okay.
Are you following that on that? Okay,
Yeah, and mine's not a devastating critique, but I am a
That's
bit
fine.
confused about that,
Yeah.
yeah. You're all right, that's good. I am a bit confused about that, the distinction between use and meaning, if use is so determinant here, because it seems to be that meaning is being determined by use, and if that's the case, which you seem to be arguing that, then even the concept of vagueness goes away, because there is no reference. We can't reference some standard of precision to determine then that we're operating in vagueness if use is determining meaning. So it would seem that the meaning of words are determined by use, and if that's the case, it goes all the way down. So we can't go up to the next level where we have a comparison of precision for words or meaning, because they're all determined by use. So, and if that's not the case, then how are we, why are we assuming that there is some meaning that has precision?
Mhm.
Like what would make us want to make that leap? And, or, does that make sense? Like,
Part of it, I think I'm with you on.
okay, so if meaning is determined by
Yeah.
use, then, and then use is how we're getting at words, you know, differentiating different words, is by the success of our actions. It seems to be that if
Okay.
you say, help me move the table, and I go and I help you move the table, then we've had some kind of mutual understanding about table, and we didn't have to think of, in that case, there's no vagueness that comes up, because there's no comparison to the table that we can say, well, that is precise and this is vague, because in the sphere of use, it's just whether or not we succeed.
Mhm.
So therefore, if meaning is determined by use, to what other level must we turn to get a concept of precision, or words that are precise, in order to say that our use is vague? Like, why would,
Oh, I see.
once we're in pragmatic
Yeah.
meaning, why even talk about vagueness?
All right.
We're now talking about success or failure
Yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah, okay.
So I don't know if that's
Right, so I've got, I think, a few thoughts about that, so, let me see if we can. All right, so to say that meaning is determined by use, I think almost anyone would want to agree with that, but that we all disagree about what that actually entails. Like, how meaning is determined by use.
Mhm.
It's really complicated, and, right, so it's fraught.
Yeah.
Sure, meaning's determined by use, but what exactly, and I think you can, distinguish between the two to some extent. Like, suppose I stick with, like, dictionary entries as my meanings. Like, yeah, they're determined by use, because the writer of the dictionary has to figure out what people mean by the words and then write it down. But it's not determined by use in the sense that, like, as we're talking, I can just throw in random words and say, oh, well, I'm using it in this completely arbitrary way, and you need to pick up on that, because that's the new meaning.
Mhm.
You know, I can say, no, meanings are kind of fixed by common usage or something, and then how they're used on a particular occasion can come apart from that. So we can have this sort of, I don't know, sort of really open meaning that, say, is in the dictionary, and then in practice, we can stipulatively narrow how we'll use the word for our current purposes. And, yeah, that's probably, and then, what else is going on? That's a really complicated question, lots of parts.
Can I just ask a follow-up?
Oh, yeah,
Just
yeah,
like
please.
maybe specify. So, would you then say that dictionary entries aren't vague? Because, I mean, it seems to me that we're just talking about degrees. I mean, I wouldn't want to deny that we have language use, right? So,
Yeah.
we're operating in a symbolic world, and we're negotiating a practical world.
Mhm.
But if we wouldn't be able to say that dictionary entries are precise or eliminate vagueness, then I'm not sure how that's qualitatively different than our practical use of this table in this room in this context at this time, et cetera.
Right, yes, I don't think we get it precision in our meanings. So, this is where I'm stumbling over my terminology a little, because I don't know how to put this. I want to say that every issue that we have with vagueness, where we feel like there's something that has to be solved, it's a matter of use. But there is a sense in which our meanings are vague in the ordinary sense of the word, right? I'm talking about when we need to resolve some problem that falls under the heading of vagueness. It's a pragmatic resolution that we should aim for. But there's absolutely this kind of feature of our words, which I think we commonly call vagueness, and it's a feature of the meanings of the words too. So, so I need to work out how to talk about that better. Because, I mean, I don't want to distort ordinary usage of the word vague too much. But there's this other thing going on with vagueness. The meanings aren't precise. Absolutely, I agree.
Yeah, that's
And the
not-
only
that's
precise
not good,
meanings we
yeah.
get are in math, like for the most part. And everything else, there's some context where it's gonna come up. You've got a borderline case that you don't know what to do with.
Silly question.
You
Go
look
ahead.
upset.
Oh yeah, I'll give it a shot. What about the like language of like Shakespeare, the historicity, the going back
Yeah.
in time and finding established authorities when some classic author uses a certain term and under a certain context in a play, even though the rendering of the play can change it based on the directorship and all the rest of it. But something like some classic texts that can reestablish the usage of the word, you know what I'm saying, the context and usage of the
Yeah.
word, but could you explain or elaborate how this theory, your ideas can reflect upon old texts and how they can help to establish more precision in the language and the explaining of this of a right precision in terms and all that? I really would be
That's
interested in
interesting.
that.
Yeah, so I think the way that would have to fit in, is something like, suppose, I'm thinking of like John Austen and the way he uses language. It's artful, right? I mean,
Right.
he's very careful with every word. None of that's an accident. Every word is used as precisely as possible. And certainly when we have disagreements about terms that have a clear specific origin, like it showed up in this Shakespearean play, this was the context, and this is how it was being used, and so now people are using it in this sloppy way, like whatever. When they say begging the question in the newspaper, they don't mean begging the question. I'll tell you what begging the question is. That's whatever. We've got our our ways of trying to say this is where this is how the word ought to be used.
Right.
Something. I think that's kind of. Then what that is, I think that's a reason that goes into a decision about where we're drawing a line.
Right.
So we're saying the word is frequently used in a variety of ways, and I think it should be used, like the line ought to be over here or something, because in this case, you're using it in a way that's ahistorical, and I'm trying to draw in this evidence
Right.
about deeper nuance that you failed to see. Yeah.
I'm just saying.
Is that kind of?
Yeah, I think I think this analysis can go much more deeper into this, historic depictions of the terms using classical text. It's really interesting how how academia views this issue, and how they support certain meanings, certain definitions of terms being applied in old texts as opposed to the sloppiness of everyday communication. But it's very interesting. I thought, well, I don't know much more to say that I want to talk about that special, but I thought it was very interesting to bring up things about classic text and how it's really be relevant.
Yeah, I'd actually like to hear more about what you have to say
I'm
about
not
that.
sure I should be dig deep.
Yeah, all right.
Not coming out, but I have some.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I have a question exactly. Sorry, this is my cold, so I probably won't be able to formulate this properly. But I have two issues that I think are related, but I'm not sure how. As you were talking, you often said that the metaphysical approach, the epistemic approach, the problem with them is that they avoid vagueness, or they want to eliminate it, or something like that. But then when you present your own case, it sounds as if you're doing kind of the same. And so I was wondering what, because in your case, vagueness arises out of certain, inferential problems that we run into, but the aim is to do away with it, right? Because otherwise communication breaks down, and so we need to deal with it, and we need to sort of avoid it in some sense. So in which way is your avoidance of vagueness kosher, whereas the other one is not? And so I wasn't quite clear on that. And then the other one is related to this issue of just the facts kind of talk. When you were presenting those cases about like marriage or personhood, or of course these are moral problems.
Mm-hmm.
And you said to eliminate the vagueness you have to kind of cite reasons or start giving reasons. You have to play the game of giving reasons. And now one issue here is when you're doing this, aren't you sort of hearkening back to factual stuff, right? So that among the reasons you're citing in order to decide whether or not you should call this a marriage are facts about people's relationships or something, or what counts as. And so if you're doing that, aren't you playing the game of sort of kind of trying to figure out what the facts are, or laying out because it sounded to me, and maybe I got this wrong, but it sounded to me as if in your pragmatic approach, you were kind of saying there is no, we kind of take a step back from factual kind of
Oh, okay.
gain.
I didn't mean that.
Yeah, so I wasn't sure about that, so I wanted to hear a little bit more just in that. And I'm not sure if the two problems are related or not, but those were the kind of things that were going through my mind. My cold,
They might be.
stricken
I don't-
mind. Anyways, go ahead.
No, those are both good questions, and I'm not sure. Well, let me try to start answering them and see if the relationship between them becomes clearer.
Okay.
So the second one, I didn't mean that we're stepping away from fact.
Uh-huh.
What I had in mind is there's a certain kind of you might want an easy solution from metaphysics alone. You might think, what we're doing here is discovering fundamental ontology.
Yeah.
I'm saying what persons are, right? And that's something that I can root out from my armchair and my metaphysics books without looking at moral facts, say.
Uh-huh.
And I think moral facts are relevant. But absolutely facts are going to be relevant to making those choices, yeah. I mean, if it's one of these kind of arbitrary decisions where it really doesn't matter, like, arranging paint tubes on the shelves, and I want all the red ones on one shelf and the orange ones on the next,
Yeah.
like, where I draw the line is irrelevant. It has some more to do with how they fit and, you know, what looks nice than, like, any serious decision. But if I'm making a kind of a serious decision about personhood or about marriage or something, absolutely, lots of facts are going to be relevant, many of them moral, but I don't think you're going to find a lot of help from fundamental ontology in either case.
Uh-huh.
You might, I mean, depends on your theory, really. but a lot of metaphysicians want to say things like, oh, poo-poo, that debate is merely verbal. And I would say, you know, there's some reason to think that frequently in metaphysics, a lot of the work could be offloaded. We could say, what's going on is that this term is vague, and the use of this term is vague in this context. And so what we need to do is look to different kinds of facts, step outside of just brute metaphysics on its own, trying to solve questions about personhood. Yeah. Although, I mean, of course I think metaphysicians are useful and important, and we do a great job of things like discovering contradictions in accounts of what personhood is, you know, lots of helpful things like that, but that looking for answers strictly in metaphysics would be a mistake. So other facts are relevant. And then the first question, how do I not eliminate vagueness myself, or what's kosher about my way of eliminating vagueness? That's a great question. I do think I have an answer. So what I think was going wrong with the other theories was not just that they were eliminating vagueness in some sense, but that they weren't even trying to explain how it is used, right? And I think vagueness is essential to ordinary language use. Like, vagueness is so important. Scott Soames is, I don't know if it's published yet. He's got a forthcoming paper, I think, on vagueness in the law. That's excellent. And just, yeah, our law would be a mess if we didn't have vagueness. You can't make your laws perfectly precise. What about all those cases you haven't thought of yet? Like, people do crazy stuff, right? You know, your laws have to be flexible enough that there's room to handle developing and new cases that you haven't thought of yet. So you don't want your laws to be perfectly precise. Schools have to be integrated with all deliberate speed. You don't say in 5 years, because that might not be possible. Or maybe it could go faster and they're dragging their feet, or, you know. So you say with all deliberate speed. Absolutely, you keep the vagueness because it's useful. So what I do is I say, here's a way of making our usage more precise when it needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
This is the method we should use when it would be appropriate to do so. But I don't want to, like epistemicism wants to say, no vagueness. Vagueness is just bad. Get rid of it all the time in every circumstance. I'm going to say, well, there are circumstances where it's a hindrance, and we need to do something about it, and here's how. But most of the time, I mean, we don't ever get to perfect precision, you know. I mean, when I stipulatively narrow the usage of a vague word, I only do it a little bit. It's just enough to handle the cases that I'm concerned about, and then I stop. So I think it's
So
really
you
not.
keep using it vaguely? So it's the idea, even in the
Absolutely.
sock example. So we got a problem, or what was it, the shirt,
Shirt.
right?
Yeah.
The shirt example. Good time thinking about socks. You know, the shirt example. We got into this problem, communication is not working. Let me fix it a little bit, but yet when I fix it, it's still vague. So I'm still using it vaguely,
Absolutely.
even though, okay.
Yep, yeah. You handle all the borderline cases that you need to,
Yeah.
but anything else,
So does this
So-
mean then that I'm using all terms vaguely all the time? Pretty much?
Mhm.
That when I say this table, you know, let's pick up this table,
You
it's
sound
kind
a
of
little
vague?
disappointed.
yeah.
Well, I'm not sorry because my common sense intuition would tell me, no, I'm not being vague, right? I mean, I think I'm being very precise and everybody's gonna understand
Right,
exactly
right.
what I'm talking about when I say, hey, let's pick up this table, right?
Which one?
So it sounds as if it's weird that now you're telling me, well, but in fact you're being kind of vague.
Well, you're not.
Well-
You're not. So that's the normal
Okay,
case.
so yeah.
Right?
Okay.
That's the normal case where the Sorites paradox doesn't arise.
Uh-huh.
Everything you've said is
Sure.
precise enough for the situation. So, so the words you're using still have this feature.
Yeah.
They're still very open.
could
They're
be vague.
subject
Uh-huh.
to further specification. They could be, yeah.
Uh-huh.
They're all still possibly vague. You haven't used them with perfect precision.
Uh-huh.
But you haven't used them vaguely in the sense that you haven't created any kind of problem, right? You haven't left undecided any borderline cases. Your usage was precise enough for the circumstances, and so it was precise enough. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, I think Rachel, and I know you can't see her
Yeah,
behind you.
yeah,
Sorry.
I'm hiding. I can see you through the camera. There's an
That's cool.
interesting
I can't see you through the
confusion.
camera.
Oh, yeah.
That's cheating.
But I really like your argument. It's really great because it allows for actual complexity of language, like humor and stuff like that can be allowed. But it occurs to me because when you said like ideas of personhood, I immediately thought of like laws about like fetuses or corporations being people, and none of those were your examples.
I
Because
forgot the corporations, yeah. Well, I did
and
mention proto-humans. I had in mind.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
But it occurred to me then that the only real problem that arises from your methodology is deciding when does something become a problem? Like when does a word become problematic? And so for some people, when a fetus becomes a person isn't important and shouldn't even be something being discussed. Whereas for other people that is very important, and then it becomes a problem for some people and not for others. And so then you have this problem of, well, who has to give the reasons? Like if I don't even think I have to give reasons of why this is a person or not, like the personhood isn't even a question, then who's got that obligation?
I see.
And then even the reasoning, like the reasons that you're giving are still going to be vague because all the terms you're using, like there isn't going to be a perfect argument because there is no epistemological truth behind the vagueness. You're never going to reach like the hard line of, oh, this is definitely the best argument for why this is a person. So in any case, I mean, I think that the continuum probably still exists, like, well, this is a better argument. But still, there's the problem of who's in charge of deciding if there's a problem or not, basically.
Right, so, as you described the case, it sounds like my answer may not be satisfying,
No.
but I think as soon as the borderline cases arise, we have a problem that needs to be resolved. So as soon as somebody brings up androids or fetuses or something,
Yeah.
we have a problem, right? Because they don't fall into clear cases on either side. We're not sure what to do with them. They're somewhere in the middle. There's disagreement, So I think we all have a problem. As soon as the
Somebody has a
context is
problem.
introduced, we've got borderline cases. Now it looks like this is preventing us from perhaps even having civil disagreements. It's problematic. So just by raising the issue, I think it becomes but I'm not sure it's a, I'm not sure I'd wanna say that, somebody can generate a political problem that way, or a personal problem, like, it's not your responsibility, you don't have to stay up nights trying to figure this out, just because somebody
Yeah.
else raised the issue. And so that's why I think my answer may not be satisfactory. What I meant by problematic is like, our communication is now impeded, because
Yeah.
these borderline cases have been made contextually relevant, and we have to say something about them. But we? Who's this we? Like,
Yeah.
can't
Yeah,
I just back out of the argument?
the
Oh,
truth
sure,
is-
yeah, back out, that's fine, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really useful for when you're dealing with particular situations, but when you're trying to make general rules and general definitions is when it gets, because then you do have to try to make this decision that transcends particular situations, and that becomes kind of weird. But I think as soon as you apply it to particular situations, it makes sense. But the actual generation of like laws and like Webster's has to deal with this.
Yeah,
But
and it's gotta be frustrating to
Yeah.
read a dictionary.
But no, it was really great. Thank you.
Oh, no, thanks for the idea, that's all.
I was gonna say a thing, I don't know, I'm not very smart or anything like that, but I was
That is
thinking,
the best preface ever. I don't believe you for a minute.
the reason you set that up is because then, if your idea sucks, then it's not your fault, but if your
Right,
idea
but
is
it's
good,
really
then
good.
not only is it good,
Right.
but you're a miracle retard.
Well,
Somehow
no, it's the
you just
devastating
have-
objection from the dumb guy in the
Yeah.
corner, right? Yeah, that's, yeah, no, please, go.
Well, okay, so I think of Quine, right? And there's this thing that he said that I always think about in all my philosophy classes, even though I'm not sure that I'm really even applying it all the time, right? And he says this thing where he says, I look at an object, I look away, I look at it again, and I assume that it's the same object instead of two different objects, right? And he makes a kind of pragmatic argument. There's a reason for that, because it's a lot simpler to live in a world where, you know, I don't have to constantly generate sort of a new account for the world every freaking time, right? And I'm thinking, to a certain extent, that we're dealing with the same problem here, only with terms rather than objects, right? And that we end up with, I mean, because we're talking about you have one word, but there's like a zillion different uses for the one word, and like one kind of weird solution, a kind of nominal solution would be just invent a bunch of new words to use in all the different contexts, right? Where we are kind of dissatisfied with the like continuum, right? So we have a word called person, and we're trying to like we have a word like for fetuses, right? Like we have a thing, we call them fetuses, right? And so then there's the question, does it fit into the personhood thing? And we could just sort of try to like just make our concepts really fine, and then that doesn't become a problem anymore, right? But the reason you don't do that is because then you need like an infinite number of terms, and you have like a finite number of terms. And then what this guy was saying, like our words come to us kind of historically, right? Like the associations, right? So I would just say that to a certain extent, I think of, or at least I'm understanding your vagueness argument to be kind of how we justify using the same kind of general terms over, kind of ranging over, you know, different areas, right? And then the argument for that becomes like basically the same argument that Quine makes about unifying. It's just because you need to be able to carve out the world within a finite number of concepts, and your brain is relatively tiny compared to the amount of things that you will actually encounter. And so that's why you need words to be vague, right? So that you don't have to constantly be inventing words. Anyway, that's it.
Yeah, I agree completely, yeah. I would go one further and say, you know, not only are we conceptually limited in how many different categories we can have for things, but we're also perceptually limited. Like, we don't see the fine-grained differences between all of the, I don't know, millions of different colors between blue and green that you could possibly discern. We can't discern the differences. And so we're limited in that way too. We absolutely have to use vagueness. It's essential.
Also, I mean, use the word texture. Why did you select that word texture, open texture? Because I thought about this vagueness, and you're talk, and I thought, well, vagueness is funny, but I mean, and texture is a funny word in its own right, but texture has this, this has texture, this bottom of this table has texture, and you can, and when I'm trying to think of a word sometimes, personally, I would think of, my brain goes to this little fuzzy area where I can get either a really strong grip on the word, or a loose grip, or it has this all, around the word, almost like in the sensory, funny way, I have this conscious, deliberate way of trying to recall a word, or something like that, and then yet, I go around the word somehow, and I do find like that I'm trying to grasp it, and if I can actually find the right, almost like texture, coloration of the word, almost like, not that I have this in Cynthia, that we sort of, not like quite like that, but in a way that our minds, our conscious minds, try to find the right word, and we're digging for it, we can actually be like Rodin, thinking like this, trying to get at the word, and yet, when you actually find it, or try to get around it, it has some texture to it. It has some kind of rough edges, it has some or clear edges or something. And I just find it interesting to use the word texture. I thought that was neat, but but I don't like the black and white. You use the word dichotomies of where you said the shades of gray, like the shade of the white shirt and the gray shirt and the black shirt. Wait a second, I thought. Many different ways of looking at the word. There's colorations. I know you're trying to make it simple for the paper, but I find it interesting that texture and coloration, all this stuff, in terms of getting at the right word, getting at the right, and nailing on the head like a poem. Boom, and you got the right word, and no one's going to question it. That is that's very important. That's very important because it's you want to have that right sense of how you have the right sense of the word, sensation, sensory of the word, smell and all that stuff, the word.
So you don't like my color terms because they're...
No, they're okay, they pick the problem pretty well, but they're limited to just shades of gray.
Yeah.
So they're not coloration and all, but I'm saying we do have that sensory apparatus that we're conscious of about getting around a word, and this is discovered in neurology texts, and they'll talk about this sort of thing too, and get around the right word and using all of the cognitive apparatuses to find the right word.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's weird, but but I like that.
No, I didn't choose open texture though. I like it, but it was actually invented by Friedrich Waismann.
No. Okay.
Yeah, so I think it really does capture this sense
it captures
of like,
the right.
because you imagine a surface that is porous, right?
Right.
And so it's got these openings in it.
Yeah, and the texture implies so much, not just the fuzziness around the object or the smoothness or whatever. You try just a tactile, you just get around you grasping something, like Aristotle is grasping the right idea.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I should really think more about the choice of words. No, because inventing technical terms is a pretty tricky business.
Yeah, it's tough.
No, and I think that one is really good. I think open texture sort of gives the right feel, and because it's tactile, maybe that's why.
And
I wish it were mine.
I don't know if it was a question. I noticed I went to a beer brewmaster's party, and these very sophisticated guys are trying to talk about the flavor of the beer.
Sure.
And it was impressive. They like to talk about the art connoisseurs, but they're beer connoisseurs.
Right, sure.
And they have
Colorado,
certain,
right?
Yeah, it's Colorado and pumpkiness. When they come to the weird, like, what is this guy talking about? I had a swig, and he's right. It's so funny. They have the sense of really getting the sense of but there's no real words. That you can't find these terms anywhere connected in any real literature about beer. You just realize that they just make it up as they go. But it's very interesting. They're such a connoisseurs. Their brains just trying to describe it using all kind of physical descriptions around the taste of beer. And they don't nail it exactly, but they try to get so close to it. You see, just by descriptions.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting.
Yeah.
We're running out of time. Maybe we could continue this informally, but I just wanted to ask one more question about because in response to Dwayne, you said, we're limited. We have all this, sensory apparatus limited and all that stuff. Why isn't this like the metaphysician's answer to the vagueness problem? Namely, the world is really vague. I mean, what is blue? Well, there's all these shades of blue, right, going on here, and so it's really, when you look at it under the microscope, it's really vague, right? So why isn't this exactly like the same answer that the metaphysician is giving? Namely, it's vague because the world is vague.
Yeah. So here's what's kind of weird about that. I think the world just is the way it is, right? And we decide how we're going to carve it up.
Right.
And so our ways of talking about it, the words we use are what fail to capture the nuance. It's not like, there's nothing vague about like this. It just is, right? And you might say there are ways of describing it that fail to capture all of its features, or that, I don't know, you might mean something that's
I
sort
mean-
of metaphorically like vagueness, but isn't, like that it doesn't have determinate boundaries. Like, but that's a matter of how we perceive it. I think it's, it's our descriptions. Like, what do you mean it doesn't have determinate boundaries? It just is, Does it become part of the table when it touches it because, like, the molecules are mingling? I mean, they just mingle. I don't know. Like, is it part of the table? Well, that's kind of how we talk about it and how we think of, we think, no, it's not part of the table. That's like our object identification. So, I mean, when the metaphysician talks about it, it gets really muddy because you use language to talk about metaphysics, right? And you don't want to say that your language is, like, part of how the world is, So I'm not sure how the metaphysician can talk about this. There's, I should have mentioned this earlier, there's some really good stuff going on in metaphysical vagueness, though, right now, that I think is much more sophisticated than the work I've seen before. It's, Elizabeth Barnes and Robbie Williams and I think Ross Cameron is in on it. They're trying to say that, well, they're not interested in the Sorites paradox, and I think that's healthy. They're saying, let's put that aside and talk about vagueness. And let's not just talk about vagueness, let's talk about indeterminacy generally, and vagueness as a part of that. So they're making the problem much bigger. Maybe that's not going to result in a good conclusion or not, but it's an interesting way to go, and I think they'll probably have very cool ideas about it once it's all worked out. So, so some metaphysical vagueness is definitely on the horizon. It looks like it might be cool, but so far, I just don't see a coherent way of making sense of it, because it seems to me like the world just kind of is.
So do people still talk, like I studied semantics and pragmatics a while ago, and like, the idea of the prototypical features of, there's a word, and it has criterial features, and so that would be a prototypical member of that class. And then as things veer off from those prototypical features, they become more borderline members of the class. And so that was one, does this sound familiar to you?
Yeah, I think
this-
that sort of picture is
I
definitely
studied
still.
psycholinguistics, and one of the big questions was, what is the relationship between pragmatics and semantics? And so so you'd have the semantic question, what is a chair? And then they would do research to say what was the prototype, what are the central criterial features of chairness based on usage? And then there would be a continuum going out from there. So, yeah, this could be a chair, but it really lacks the prototypical features of a chair. So I just wondered if that was just like something that people don't look at anymore, or this very intimate relationship between the pragmatic, the usage, and then how you define the term.
Can I interrupt just for a
Oh,
second?
yeah.
Why don't we continue the conversation over refreshments more informally, and let us thank our speaker, because we ran out of time, and so people might want to
okay.
walk
Okay.
out. So thank you again.
Thank you. Yeah, so as far as I know, people are not